Hello my friends and welcome back. I'm Chisgule Gaming, and in today's video, sponsored by the makers of Call of Dragons, we're updating my artifact tier list. And we're making it a legendary artifact tier list because the epics were just taking up too much space. And I want to focus in on which artifacts really are the very best. And I'm going to narrow it down to one artifact for each troop type at most in the S tier, okay? And I want to do that because I want to really pull forward what actually is the best of the best. So I'm going to go now and start to add the 3 new artifacts that have landed in game since the last time I did this list. That includes the Wolf Horn, the Deathless Vines, and also the new Shield of Sturdiness. And why don't we start there, since I actually maxed out the Shield of Sturdiness, I maxed Anfell, and I maxed Magro. And I think that if you are shoving enemies around and going up bridges, it's going to be really insane. I think it's going to be really cool for pushing into an enemy's position. If and only if you can use this thing very skillfully, then I believe that it is the strongest infantry artifact. And it does a couple things. First of all, it's giving you health. It's also giving you attack. So this thing is really about enhancing skill damage in a lot of ways. That's also the passive effect. If your primary hero uses a rage skill, then well, technically it works for the secondary hero. If a hero uses a rage skill for the next 5 seconds, you're going to have increased skill damage. But for the most part, that duration is short enough that your primary hero uses a rage skill, and if your secondary does skill damage, it'll get the benefit of it. I mean, this shield was designed for Danfell to be primary, Magro to be secondary, and all of the 3 seconds of Magro skill damage would be enhanced by the shield. And as I mentioned, if only one artifact can be in the S tier for each troop type, that means I would bump down the Spirit Bone Torque. I actually think I prefer the Spirit Bone Torque for its simplicity of use. It does not ask much of you. You just use it, enemies get taunted, and it's very, very simple. I like that a lot. You know you're getting decent value from the counterattack, but if, under the assumption, you actually can push objectives like bridges, choke points is what I'm trying to say, by shoving an enemy out with enough shields, then I would argue shield is critical. So we're going to leave it here for now in the S tier. And since we're talking about infantry stuff, what about these Deathless Vines? Well, they obviously can't be as highly rated as the shield. Only one thing goes in S. And the Spirit Bone Torque is good. I would say Deathless Vines are similar-ish, but I'm going to put them lower in the rankings, more to the right. I mean, typically in a tier list, to the left means better than the stuff to the right. And the reason I put it all the way on the right, but still at an A, is that it is a 7.5% artifact. 7.5% artifacts are very good. And the thing I will point out is that it seems to be designed for Garwood. So this is like a weird, head nod to Garwood, because this thing makes it so that it has a lower cooldown the more healing you do. So I heard you can get to like a 40-second cooldown on the activation on this, which is pretty cool if you are freezing enemies in place. If what you care about is Roots of War, I think this thing is cracked. But I don't think for your typical open field fighting, it is that cracked, because I think whoever's using it is going to pop in the blink of an eye anyways. You're not likely to get extra activations of this thing. So the sort of passive ability likely does nothing for you. And you don't really get an extra benefit for Rally Garrison with this thing either. So I think it's a cool 7.5% artifact with a healing synergy that maybe gets more value sometime in the future if there's another hero that pairs with Garwood that does big healing. Now this brings us to the Wolf Howl Horn, which if you're a Cav player, this thing is insane. The Wolf Stick does things that are just very powerful. We're going to put it all the way up at the S tier, at the back of S tier, because yeah, it's like really good, but also, I don't know, it's a Cav artifact, and Cavs are just very difficult to use. They're not the thing that determines the season typically, but you can do ridiculous damage in the backline if you know what you're doing, right? It's your infantry, your marksmen, and your mages that do the sort of brunt of the lift when you are battling for control of a space. All right, so with all of that said, I mentioned that I can't have 2 things of the same troop type in a rarity, and there's 2 mage artifacts up here, so I'm going to have to bump one of them down. All right. We have the Mirage Orb and we've got the Infernal Flame. And the funny thing is that I really like using not Burton Tohar, but Lillian Velen in things like the Paramount Championship. But I think from a raw power level standpoint, the Mirage Orb is better. So I'm going to bump the Infernal down, and I'm going to put that sort of near the front of the A tier. I feel like Lillian Velen still slay. The Infernal Flame is amazing, but I would not make that the one artifact that goes in the S tier, right? Because Mirage Orb does big damage and big stuns, and I think that's just insanely powerful for mages to be doing. Now, I think the best artifact in the game probably is the crossbow, which is unfortunate because I didn't get it. And now I'm sitting here thinking, gosh, like many seasons later, should I be getting the crossbow for Magrat and Zeta? But Magrat and Zeta are the highest merit earning march I have. So if I could go back in time and have spent the money to have maxed this bow, I definitely would have done it. This thing absolutely slaps. It's got a nice passive effect that works well with Zeta specifically, where if you have stacks on your hero, you ignore enemy hit points, and that's just really good. So I would actually argue probably in this sort of an order, like those are your S tier artifacts. But at the A tier, I do want to shift a few things around. So one thing I want to do is I want to take this Rattle Spear. I want to bump it down to the front of B. The big problem with the Rattle Spear is you have to be standing still to get value from it. And I actually find more often than not, the activation of the Rattle Spear gets my march caught out and it dies. So I think it might actively just not be good. It might be bad at this point. And Kanara and Hosk, I'm like generally not on that plan anymore anyways. I've got more powerful stuff. So I would argue Rattle Spear is an artifact that does not really stand the test of time. I also really like these blades over here, but I don't use them at all, the spring blades. And, you know, when I was running around with calves, they were really cool. And if you are a Cav player, they're really good. And they are 7.5 artifact. But I think for your average player, like you're not running calves. And I probably have to bump this down too, just in terms of its overall relevance for what will win or lose the season. Now, this brings us to kind of a weird spot where I want to bump something up. And it's actually this armor right over here. And I want to bump it back, the Dragon Scale armor, back up to an A. And you might be like, well, that's kind of weird. Like, why would you do that? Well, with the release of Danfel, who has a shield, you actually can use this armor on Danfel and trigger the passive ability from this artifact, which reduces the range damage you take, which I think maybe stacks with Danfel, but I'm not actually sure. But either way, I think that in the meta we're in, where infantry need to charge in and live, the Dragon Scale armor giving hit points, shielding, and range damage resistance is just really, really where you want it to be. I still feel like, especially in a world with auto casting, things like the Gold Crest are better, but not amazing. I would leave that in an A. I certainly wouldn't take it to S. I don't think I'd bump it down to B. I do feel like the Warhammer is really awesome. I think it's maybe not right to have it in front of the Gold Crest here, though. And I think the Phoenix Eye is really awesome. I really like these artifacts. Very, very powerful. Okay, not trying to bump that up to S, just trying to highlight it. I think it's really good. Now, looking down in this list, is there anything I would bump up or down? And I do think that there are a couple changes I need to make. One is the Wolf Woman of Healer. I think I need to bump up to a B. And also the Storm Arrows. The reason is that you can use those with infantry and do silly things, blocking an enemy's position. And it's possible they should even be higher than B and should all be all the way up at A. Like, you can do things. Honestly, it's kind of weird and unfortunate that they aren't for infantry specifically. And it's probably for the best that we don't have cavalry as tanky as infantry are, that you could do that with to block an enemy's position. That would be such a yikes. The other thing I want to move up that I had at utility is this guy right over here, which activates to do a onslaught buff. I think it is pretty cool if you brought out lots of marksmen. I think it's fair to put that into C, but I don't know that I would go higher than a C on this artifact. It's the Heart of Kamasi. I feel like you could maybe justify bringing it up to a B, but I don't know, man. Like, would you rather have the Viola's bow silence? Would you rather have the big AoE damage? You really are being asked a lot for this artifact, where it's like, man, you need to have 3 marksman marches yourself, and also if they already have an onslaught buff, it won't stack with it. So I think we could bump that to the C, and we maybe leave it there. The only 2 artifacts I'm missing as I look at this is the Mana Stone Hunter and the Mad Goblin's Boon, which would be utility / well, I can rename this to the utility category. There's no longer non-legendaries in here, and I think that's where I would leave it. With those changes, I'd say this list is pretty good. The only swap I would consider making is with the Shield and the Spirit Bone Torque. If you are not the kind of player who is going to micromanage the charge that this does, then I think you might actually switch the value of the Spirit Bone Torque and the Shield. Because did you actually want to shove into the enemy's position at an unexpected moment? Maybe. Maybe not. So I think that if you're going to micromanage, this thing is nuts. And if you're not, I would say Spirit Bone Torque is just easier to use. All right? So that is the update to my legendary tier list for Call of Dragons. I feel pretty good about this. I think I might actually bump the Deathless Vines. Well, we'll leave it here. In Roots of War, I think this thing is cracked. Like, controlling the enemy's position, first of all, is incredible. But then having a reduced cooldown is incredible in that game mod specifically, because I think infantry play a bigger role there, because there just isn't as many troops that gum up one position as you'd see in a seasonal battle. So I think this is good. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. I'm actually very eager for those. I think, again, the only regret artifact that I've got, actually, I have 2 regret artifacts. It's really, I went for this guy over here. Let me look up the name. I've blanked it from my mind because I wish I'd sort of been more patient. The Breath of Jargantus. I wish this had either a bigger AoE template or I'd been patient. It does a huge defense break on a bunch of targets that are stacked up on top of each other. It's good, but it's not a 7.5% artifact. I wish I had waited for the Mirage Orb instead, right? And the other mistake artifact or regret artifact I've got is this guy right over here is not going for it. I don't know if we call that a mistake artifact, but you kind of know what I mean. Like, I really wish I had pushed for this guy and maxed it, quite frankly. Because Mags A, holy cow, that thing is just like. If you enjoyed the vid, throw a like on here, subscribe to the channel. Alternatively, if you want to see my Magro and Danvel vids, check the cards in the end screen. I maxed them both at this point, and they're good. They're good, but they're not as tanky. Like, they do something different. And that, well, yeah, you can watch the vids. You can see what I mean.